Hi, Janeites. If you're listening, please follow and subscribe. It really helps to grow the podcast and for me to bring you more episodes. And welcome to episode 11 of the What the Austen podcast. I'm really excited to say that today I'm joined by Charlie from the Book Boy Bookstagram account. So hi, Charlie. I'm so pleased you wanted to do this episode with me.
I'm really glad to do it. I'm looking forward to it.
Amazing. So it'd be really great to hear before we start, what made you start your Bookstagram originally, and also what got you into Jane Austen?
Well, I started my Bookstagram because I had a personal account on Instagram and I just occasionally started taking photos of books just because I liked them. And then I kind of thought, well, what if I just had a whole account about books, and kind of went from there. And I also had a friend who was a Bookstagrammer who was like, why don't you just do it? So I did. And that's that, really.
Absolutely. And your aesthetic is honestly gold dust. If anyone doesn't follow Charlie, you need to. His aesthetic is amazing.
It's just kind of, I don't even really know what my aesthetic is. It's just kind of me messing about, really, but make it work. But with Jane Austen, I think what really got me into her books was this is going to sound really weird, but I went to summer camp when I was 16 and I took with me all 7 of her novels in one giant paperback. I think it had Keira Knightley on the front. You know, it was a kind of movie tie-in one. Yeah. And I just thought, I'm just going to read them all. And so in the kind of 4 weeks I was away for summer camp, I read every single Jane Austen novel in a row, all in one chunk. And yeah, I just love them. I just instantly just found them captivating and fascinating, and that whole world. And yeah, that whole summer was great. It was a really good time.
You're in summer camp and you're just in your room reading Austen.
Yeah, exactly. Like avoiding people, living my best Regency life.
Everyone's outside like kayaking and stuff. And you're just
exactly. Do you want to play Frisbee? Not really.
No, not unless it involves Elizabeth Bennet, thanks.
Exactly. Like, how much do you earn a year? And we'll think about it.
Yeah. So true. And actually that's so fitting because today's episode is called Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? It's not at all related to the game show in any way.
Yeah, please don't quiz me.
Yeah, Charlie's here to be quizzed. Actually, we're going to be discussing the wealth and how this is portrayed within Austen's novels. So who the wealthiest hero is, how their income is talked about by other characters, if at all, how it's generated in the first place, and what does this mean for them in terms of marriage. So a lot of you know, I really love covering the theme of money in Austen's novels. I just find it fascinating. But yeah, a lot of Austen's work revolves around her heroines, their quest for love, but also their trials and tribulations of needing economic security. Apart from Emma, as me and Charlie were discussing in our pre-meeting.
I mean, she has a great life, doesn't she? I mean, yeah, she's in a huge contrast to everyone else, really, isn't she? If you look at all the main characters, we're looking at people who are from fairly low income scenarios, and most of the time either they've already lost their wealth or they're not going to inherit the wealth from their fathers or whatever because they're all women. And then we've got Emma, who's just doesn't care. So, good for her.
I know, totally living her best life. And I think she totally knows it as well, which I also think is amazing. Maybe Jane got bored of having poor characters. She was like, I need an Emma in my life. I need a rich
She did write it, didn't she? When she wrote a letter, didn't she, saying that I'm writing a character that I think only I will like. But I love Emma. I think she's great. So
Emma's literally one of my favorite characters, but I know absolutely a lot of people detest her, but I'm here like a true Emma fan for sure. So money is definitely super important in Jane's novels. And she said herself, female economy will do a great deal, but it cannot turn a small income into a large one. And that is very true. So that's why today we'll be focusing more on the heroes, because they're kind of that starting pot of money. And we'll go from there. So I'm interested to know your general thoughts on money in Austen. And did you think there was a hero who was the wealthiest? Have you thought about it at all before this point?
I mean, I have thought about it. I mean, I think when you read Austen, it is so prevalent in the very characters of the book. I mean, when you think about characters wildly, we are mostly aware of the economical status. I mean, even if we look at Emma, for example, we know she's handsome and rich from the first sentence. And then we get later in and we know that Miss Bates is poor, you know, whether that is poor in terms of actual poor of what we'd consider poor today, or poor from the fact that she's, you know, descended in standing. She's still, you know, a woman of various connections. Obviously, she's friends with Emma and her family, but, you know, she's poor in terms that she has no income. She'll only continue to get poorer because she doesn't have a husband or a profession. So, you know, what can we do? So we are kind of given those clues about everyone, I would say, for the most part, at least kind of a general group that they would fit in within a kind of financial hierarchy, which is interesting.
Yeah, that is really interesting about Austen. It's almost an essential part of their character where they will financially fall. And I think that's quite different to some other books. Like if you look at kind of later books like Bronte, that kind of thing, I don't think there's that much focus on their finances as much as Austen does. Like it is very much like a lot of the first lines, like you were saying, do even comment on wealth. So
yeah, I think it's just it's a foundational part of it. I think because they are society novels in a way, aren't they? I mean, we're looking at a snapshot of a society and the movements within it. So by setting the pieces in their financial areas, then we can get the proper idea of who's moving up and who's moving down, basically. So
no, 100%. I totally agree with you. And I will say before we start that this isn't a black and white topic, guys. Obviously, we've done a bit of research for this episode, but we're not here sat as historical, economical experts on money in the Regency era. This is really just a discussion based on what we found and what the books tell us, that kind of thing. So I thought, just for context, before we start, I want to highlight to everybody listening that there's a difference between a fortune and income in Austen's books. So if we think about this in monopoly terms, the fortune would be the grand total of your houses, your hotels, your property cards, the cash you've got stored underneath the mat, compared to your income, which would be the money that you get when someone lands on your properties, when you pass go, or any interest you get from the little cards that you pick up from the middle. So most characters' yearly income is actually interest gained from their fortune. Their interest is around 5%, it would seem, in Regency era. So you would invest your money and you gain about 5% from that, and that's what you'd live off. Any secondary reading that I've done, and any that Charlie wants to add as well, I'll totally add into the bio section so that you can do extra reading on this. But yeah, and also I'd like to say I might make occasional references to how this relates to modern day, but because inflation's changed so much and is totally varied, it's very hard to do that. So don't look for accuracy. Just look at it as an estimate and a broad range.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm definitely not an expert, so we're just going to have to. I think you know, anything that we say will probably be roundabout correct. I mean, obviously we won't be 100% on figures. No one could be, because of inflation, as you say, is so different from how it was. I mean, what was you sent me some reading before, and I think it said inflation after 1913 would be spot on because of certain things in place. But obviously these novels are way before then, so they can't accurately be assessed to current.
No, 100%. We're talking about like 100 years like ago plus. So it'd be so difficult for us to kind of estimate that now. And I think in any term, any investment, a 5% return is pretty good. So
right. Wish we could get that these days.
But 100% sure how we'd even like equate that to nowadays. But there is like a rough idea of, we could see what that would mean they would be earning in this day and age. So yeah, you know, I'm happy to start jumping in on it. I thought we could start with Pride and Prejudice. My listeners know I always start with Pride and Prejudice. This isn't a favoritism, guys. It is just chronologically, it always works out this way for me. But yeah, I know. I thought the character would start with is actually Mr. Bingley, though, just because he's one of the first ones mentioned in terms of wealth when it comes to a hero in Pride and Prejudice. So even the start of the book, we hear Mrs. Bennet saying, "A single man of large fortune, 4,000 or 5,000 a year. What a fine thing for our girls." So we're just instantly, boom, Mr. Bingley, and he's a money pot.
He's got money, so let's go to that ball, which is fair play. I mean, I think, in a way, Bingley, he is a great prospect, isn't he? Obviously, he has Netherfield, so he's letting Netherfield, so, he's got the income to do so. So he's a man of property. He's also single, and if you've got, well, how many daughters have we got here? Five. So, sorry, I don't know what that was. That's a lot of daughters to marry off, and none of them are. They're all out in society, so get on it, basically. It's the vibe, isn't it? So...
Yeah, now is the time. I think that definitely you can tell the excitement, because I think obviously living in Longbourn, Meryton, there's clearly not that many single men dotting about, especially of 5,000 a year. So, because obviously this house has been sat vacant as well. So it's obviously exciting that someone's come in with money who's now letting that property out. So Bingley's yearly income is set to be about 5,000 a year. And going off the 5% theory, that would mean his kind of total net fortune would be about £100,000. And we have to remember, like Charlie was saying, he's let in Netherfield, so he doesn't actually have a property in his own right, like Mr. Darcy does. And also the really interesting thing about Bingley is his money's from trade. So he's not necessarily, he has inherited it from his father, but this isn't old money. This isn't like a family estate that's being passed down. Yeah, I mean, what are your thoughts on Mr. Bingley and his income?
I mean, it's interesting, actually. I mean, as he's from trade, it's quite curious that, I mean, obviously back then, we're still looking at a time where trade money is still looked down upon in comparison to, aristocracy and inherited wealth. So it's quite interesting that even though he is from that background, people are still very excited about him, and there's not that kind of slight edge of, oh, but he's made it through that way. Or, I mean, I guess because he didn't make it himself, did he? So maybe that one generational gap of his father making it has made it a bit more acceptable. I'm not really sure on the social ideas of that time of like how far down it would have to count as sort of inheritance wealth. But
no, that's actually such a good point. I didn't think about that. Like maybe that generation gap is what kind of smooths the way for him.
That makes it okay, because he's already a gentleman rather than someone who has worked to get that money. But it's still pretty fresh, isn't it? So I think, a lot of maybe the real nobility of the time would have still looked down on Mr. Bingley, despite being a man of means. So
that's so true. And you know what really I always found interesting about this is Caroline Bingley really looks down on the Gardiners, and yet their income source is exactly the same, apart from obviously Mr. Gardiner's probably a little bit more in on the actual business side of things still.
Maybe it's because it's too close to home. Maybe it's very much we've escaped that sphere just about, so now I have to look down on it to make clear that I'm no longer from that area anymore kind of vibe, which would explain why she's so horrible.
Right. Yeah, maybe it's like an insecurity about her status still. Like maybe I mean, that would also explain her desperation to marry Darcy. Like that would definitely secure her in kind of higher society if she was to marry Darcy. That it would basically just wash away the links of her past, to be honest with you.
So, I mean, there's that real link she wants there with proper aristocracy and, well, kind of at least inherited wealth and families of good standing. She's desperate for it to happen. So,
and I think it's interesting because they say that Mr. Bingley's father, he was trying to buy an estate before he died. So you could definitely see, even for his father, it was like they needed those foundations to really place themselves in society. I think what helps Mr. Bingley the most is his friendship with Darcy. Even though everyone's quite excited that he's coming around, I can imagine that's created a lot more connections.
It's quite an interesting friendship if you do think that. I mean, I've not ever really thought about this, and now it's all kind of clicking into place. But it is weird that Darcy is friends with him in a way. There's not that level of snobbery there against it. And maybe that's a very early hint straight away that he is kind of a better person than he's originally perceived as. Maybe we are prejudiced against him ourselves straight away.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Like maybe that's just like a hidden link that Mr. Darcy's actually a really nice guy and doesn't really look down on people. Like I think obviously like his upbringing means that he has that occasional kind of snobbery to things that he does, especially when he looks a lot down on the Bennets for their actions and behaviours. But absolutely, I think his connection with the Bingleys and that they're so close and stay at each other's houses definitely shows that he's got a more softer side and is more accepting and probably forward thinking as well, because obviously you can tell that it's the Bingleys of the world that are probably now the ones coming up with all the money.
It's progressive, isn't it? Especially at that kind of time. It's an attitude which, wouldn't really be adopted for a long time afterwards. So who knew?
Right. This also got me thinking as well, though. Maybe that explains more about why Darcy was reluctant for Charles to marry Jane, because maybe he was thinking, oh, you're kind of on the borders of being accepted in society. Marrying Jane's really not going to do you many favors. And I didn't think about that till I started researching this one. And I thought maybe that it's more about that. Maybe that's why he's more worried about Bingley marrying into the Bennet family as opposed to Darcy, because Darcy's very established.
That makes sense, actually, yeah, completely, because it would be kind of like stepping back down again, wouldn't it? Making a connection with someone who would viably be within your field anyway. The Bennet women aren't rich. They've got a bit of a dowry, but they're not, wealthy. So, yeah, it would be very much aligning with someone technically beneath him, but on the sort of level he's already come from. So, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I thought that was really interesting as well when you think about it from that perspective. Is there anything else that you want to say about Bingley and his position?
I don't think so. I think we've covered him pretty well, actually. And, definitely got some interesting points, which even I haven't really thought of. He's got all of these things just in his status, and his financial makeup is actually what makes his character so interesting. We don't really get much of him from the book, do we, really? So,
right.
Yeah.
Also, I think it's really interesting that we don't really hear much about his business. Like, we often hear Darcy needing to go and sort business out or writing letters to his steward, that kind of thing. But I think there's only one real reference to Bingley sorting business in town, and that's when Caroline writes to Jane and says, Charles thought his business would be concluded in a couple of days, but we can't see that being the case. I think that's interesting as well. But although I never see Bingley as this kind of intellectual, business savvy kind of guy, to be honest with you.
He seems quite like a happy-go-lucky kind of guy, doesn't he? So just happy and merry, and the kind of nice personality opposite to Darcy as well.
But on that note, then, I think it would be good to talk a bit about Mr. Darcy and his income. So soon after we hear about Bingley and everyone's excited about that, then everyone finds out about Mr. Darcy and his fortune. So I'm going to paraphrase a couple of quotes that kind of came out of this. So Mr. Darcy soon drew the attention of the room by his fine, tall person, handsome features, and the report, which in general circulation within 5 minutes after his entrance, of having 10,000 a year, for he was discovered to be proud, to be above his company and above being pleased. And not all his large estate in Derbyshire could have then saved him from having a most formidable, disagreeable countenance and being unworthy to be compared with his friend. So we have a mixed bag there. One, he's handsome and rich, but all the riches in the world can't save you if you've got a terrible personality, it would seem.
I mean, I just love how that, one sort of couple of sentences are just such a damning overall portrait of one person, aren't they? He's rich, he's handsome, but also just not nice. Great.
It's so funny. And I love in a lot of the adaptations where Elizabeth teases her mum. She's like, oh, he's not quite so handsome, is he? Once Mrs. Bennet's slagging him off, she's like, no, not at all.
Exactly. So great. I think the adaptations, both of the one, I've only seen 2 adaptations of Pride and Prejudice, but I think both of them do a good job of that kind of initial intro scene, and a little take on it, but it's really good.
Yeah, I really enjoy that. So Mr. Darcy's yearly income is set to be 10,000 a year, but estimated a fortune of about £200,000. He owns half of Derbyshire, the miserable half, and but because of inflation, everything, like I was saying, it's hard to kind of judge what that would be nowadays, but it's estimated that that's about 100 million his fortune, which is massive. That is a massive fortune. Wow.
He's not going to be wanting money anytime soon, is he? Crazy.
I mean, these big estates are expensive to keep, but I still think he'll be enjoying his time, that's for sure.
I think nothing could kind of impact that kind of money, can it? It's kind of Jeff Bezos kind of Elon Musk kind of vibes.
Yeah, Mr. Darcy going to space or setting up Amazon. I can see it.
Yeah, absolutely. If he had the opportunity, he would. You know, he would.
Absolutely. I feel it should be like a modern day take on Pride and Prejudice. It's like Elon Musk just misunderstood.
Yeah, I mean, I'd absolutely watch it, but hate myself for doing so.
Totally. If someone does that, we want to cut now, thanks.
Absolutely. We're trademarking it here.
Yeah, 100%. So basically with Darcy's income, what's interesting is a lot of it goes off gossip. But there's more confirmation later on. Obviously, when Elizabeth goes to Pemberley, we kind of see that he has got this massive estate. And when he writes the letter to Elizabeth about Wickham's character, we realise that Georgiana's got an inheritance of £30,000. So that kind of starts to put things into place, and we do recognise that, yeah, this is a wealthy guy.
Yeah.
So...
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, like, if we put this into perspective, so Georgiana's got about £30,000. The Bennets, Mr. Bennet's total income a year is £2,000. So this is like a significant difference, like 2,000, and he's got 5 daughters, etc. And then you've got Mr. Darcy, who's got 10,000, no children as of yet. Obviously, we don't know what happens after the novel. At the start of the novel, he has no wife. He obviously has a sister. But he's got little expenses, I would say, and a lot of money coming in. What are your thoughts in general on Darcy?
Yeah, he obviously doesn't have many expenditures at all, really. I mean, his estate, as you say, will take money, but that level of fortune, again, it just wouldn't touch the sides. It would be an obscene amount of money. And if you think he doesn't like socializing, so he won't be hosting balls, he won't be hosting expensive events, he's just minted. It's like a dragon on top of a pile of gold. It's crazy.
Yeah. Who doesn't like to socialize? It's so true.
Exactly. I love it. Good for him.
Yeah,
but...
like the rest of us, we're all here like, we can relate, Darcy.
He would have loved the pandemic, just sitting at home, counting money. I mean, he would be fine.
Living the dream. So I'd say that Mr. Darcy's only liability is actually the fact that he's got the connection to Mr. Wickham, who keeps rocking up for money. So he obviously pays Wickham off and with the estate that he was supposed to get as a clergy. And as I say on every episode, I'm so glad Mr. Wickham wasn't a clergy. That would be a terrible job for him, probably the worst.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't really align with his character, I would say.
Not at all. So he paid him out for that, and then Mr. Wickham came back asking for more money, which again he got, so he could go and study the law. And then he came back again asking for more money, which then Mr. Darcy refused, because you can have obviously someone can get on your nerves a little bit after a while to keep asking for all your money, despite how much money you do have. You don't want to be handing it all to Mr. Wickham, who's clearly not very financially savvy. So
yeah, true. He's definitely not quite the same character, is he? Don't think money lasts long with Mr. Wickham.
He's clearly not investing it and getting his 5%, let's say that.
No.
So
Absolutely not.
So that's probably Mr. Darcy's kind of downfall, is his connection with Wickham. And unfortunately, he doesn't escape that by the end of the book, because he has to kind of pay for the wedding of Lydia and Wickham to stop the Bennets being disgraced in society, and he has to pay off Wickham's debt. He also has to pay for Wickham's commission as well in the military. So, I mean, that's a lot of money that's put aside, and I'm sure we can all agree that that wouldn't be the end of it.
No, absolutely. I feel, yeah, give it another kind of, 6 months, he'd come back. What if they had kids? He'd probably somehow work into needing money for that. I mean, I feel like Wickham's going to be a shadow there, and especially as now he's married Lydia and therefore has a tie to Darcy's wife, Elizabeth. I mean, he's just there forever. He's thinly connected, but just never going to go. So it's quite a shame, really.
Absolutely. And I don't think Lydia has got kind of the financial touch either. So she absolutely is going to be expensive as well. And yeah, it's just a shame. I feel like that's Darcy's downfall. It's Wickham.
Agreed. Kind of like a shadow always hanging over him a little bit. But again, if he is earning that much money and he does have that larger fortune, would it make a huge impact? I mean, he's never going to be wanting money, but still not great to give it to other people. But, you know, it's probably not going to ruin him, is it? So...
I know. It does make you wonder how much money like Wickham burns through, though, with his gambling habit. Because obviously he tries to marry Georgiana as well, like elope with her and take her £30,000. But again, he obviously can't deal with these fixed incomes. He needs like bits of income coming in. He obviously, when you give him money as a total, he just gambles it away.
But I mean, it's a lot of money. I just feel like if he didn't gamble it, he would be fairly well off. Just leave it. Just chill. There's just no need.
Wickham, look at these interest rates. Come on.
Exactly. Just invest it. I mean, you'll be fine. Just absolutely fine. But
I know.
Oh well.
I know. So funny though. But yeah, so when I first thought about this before researching, for me it was like Mr. Darcy was the wealthiest hero. The way they talk about it is very different than the other novels and how they talk about the hero's wealth. So this is very much upfront. We know exactly what he's earning. We see his estate, which I think we see a lot of the estates in the novels, but I think this is the one that goes into the most detail. And we get basically a tour of Pemberley with the gardeners in Elizabeth. So
yeah, you're right. I think, yeah, we do see other estates, obviously, to some extent, as you say. But I think if we look at the main heroes, so what, in Northanger Abbey, although we see Northanger Abbey, that's not his inheritance. It's not Henry's inheritance. So he'll have a parish. No, is that right?
Yeah.
Parsonage?
Yeah, he's going to be like a vicar somewhere.
Yeah, so he's going to have obviously a much smaller actual property scale there. So that's him. Mr. Knightley, we know, does have an estate.
Yep, Donwell Abbey. Yep.
Yeah, but we don't. Well, we do go to Donwell briefly, don't we?
To pick strawberries. Yeah.
Pick strawberries, as you do. Love that. So yeah, obviously Knightley we know has got a nice kind of income going on.
A nice house. We hear about Colonel Brandon's, and I think they're supposed to go on a trip there, but I don't know if it ever happens. So
isn't it? It's meant to happen, the picnic, and then he gets the letter and has to rush off, so it's cancelled before they go. Possibly.
Yes. Yeah.
It's been a while
absolutely.
since I've read
No, absolutely. And there's so many of the heroes where it's like they're actually maybe the second son, and so they're going to be a clergyman or what have you. So
Edmund from Mansfield Park, he's not going to inherit Mansfield Park either because he's the second son. So it's quite interesting that quite a few of the heroes aren't endowed with great properties and are more of the clergy side. So yeah,
it's also interesting a lot of them have more siblings, whereas it's just Darcy and Georgiana, and he inherits everything, and Georgiana's obviously the female, so she gets her inheritance as well, but it's like a portion that's put aside for her.
I mean, he's a great catch, really. In terms of financial, he is number one what you want to go for, if that's what you're looking for, which I imagine for a lot of people back then it was. So, yeah.
Exactly. Okay, no, I love that then. So before we start dissecting the next hero, I'd like to say a little bit about Audible. So moving on to another novel, we have Colonel Brandon. So I did do a whole episode on Colonel Brandon way back when, and we talked about him in some detail, but I don't think we got that much into his financial situation. So this will be really interesting. So I believe Colonel Brandon was a difficult one for me to find too much about, but basically I believe his income is about $2,000 a year. He was actually the second son, but his eldest brother dies or something like that, or he goes to war and his eldest brother's dealing with the money, that kind of thing. And Delaford, which is his estate, is now without debt, according to Mrs. Jennings, because Brandon cleared all of his brother's debts off. Brandon has very little expenses, Mrs. Jennings says, because he obviously is just on his own. But yeah, I mean, 2,000 a year isn't that much. That's the equivalent of what the Bennets have, which is really interesting.
Yeah, that is. I think, but again, he doesn't have 5 daughters, a wife. So, 2,000 stretches a lot further when you don't have 6 other people relying on it, I suppose.
Right.
But yeah, you're right. You would have. I expected him to be richer than that, I think. And because he's older as well. He is, in terms of age, I think he's older than Mr. Darcy in comparison, right? I think Colonel Brandon is a more mature man. So in a way, I kind of expected him just to be more well off because he's further along in life, which I don't think is a thing, really. But
no, totally. And I think maybe what his downfall's been is that he's had to make up for his brother's debt and all the mistakes that he made, that maybe it's taken this long for him to get back on his feet.
Absolutely. I mean, we kind of learn a bit about that, don't we? I mean, he says that he used to know someone just like Marianne, who obviously all these people he wants to help. I think he's a very nice man, maybe almost too nice to his detriment in terms of financial, perspective, unfortunately.
Right. Well, we even see that in the book when Edward's cut off from his fortune. Colonel Brandon's like the first one to jump in and be like, I have an estate for Edward that he can have, but he's like, it's only 300 a year, so he won't be able to marry anyone. But it's really interesting, like you said, maybe this is Colonel Brandon's downfall. He's just too nice of a guy, and he wants to help the people that are struggling.
I mean, well, can you imagine someone coming up to you and being like, oh, I have an estate because you're on hard times? I'd be like, yes. Yeah. Absolutely, sure, bring it on. I won't get married, it's fine. Can you imagine anyone doing that today? It's just real altruism.
No, I know. Yeah, absolutely. You can see Colonel Brandon being somebody who'd like donate loads of money to charity or something.
And like almost make himself poor from doing so, which is really, I mean, it is kind of, if you think about it, that's the meaning of charity, I suppose. But like, it's, not something you see these days, is it? So
no, exactly. And I feel like the fact that he does have a church on his estate that he could give to Edward probably means that there is quite a lot of tenants on his estate as well, because usually that's why there's a church there, so that like obviously people who work for you can go to church together. I'm assuming. I think that's the case. Like when I look at like Poldark and stuff, that seems to be the case. Everyone goes to church together, and yeah, I
think so. And then obviously, he would get the front bench because he's the most important, right? And then everyone behind.
Exactly.
So going on my limited knowledge.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Churches on estates.
So I'm thinking he's got some income from his estate, and maybe with time that money went up. I mean, 2000's what I found. Like I said, everyone, I mean, when you do this research, it is difficult to pinpoint at times how much people are worth, but that is kind of the number that I found the most.
Yeah, I think that must be about right. Did you manage to look at the other characters from Sense and Sensibility much? Did you have a look at what they were kind of on and in comparison to Colonel Brandon?
Yeah, so I think they're pretty much like all around the same ballpark, actually. I mean, it might just be a book where the people do have less going on for them, I guess. What's really interesting about Sense and Sensibility is the Edward's situation where he's meant to inherit the fortune, etc. And then the fact that his mum, so the female line, is able to take that away. Now, I think a lot of people think because of Pride and Prejudice and the fact that the estate is entailed away from the Bennet siblings, that basically that happens in all cases. But it actually doesn't. So a woman can inherit property or money if she is the only direct heir. And when she marries, a settlement can ensure that the property or the money stays with her children. So we see that in the case of Lady Catherine. She's able to pass the fortune over to Lady Anne de Burgh. And also in this case, it's Mrs. Ferrars who has control of the money, even though she's a widow. I believe it's in her name, the money is, so she's able to say, I'm taking it from Edward and I'm giving it to Robert instead, even though he's the second son. I mean, this totally backfires. I think it's absolutely hilarious that she does this because Edward wants to marry Lucy Steele, and then Lucy Steele goes for Robert instead. And because Robert's been given this, he no longer has to ask his mother for permission.
Lucy rocked it, didn't she, really? Underappreciated mastermind is our Lucy Steele, I feel.
There is nobody more calculated. Come on. I mean, seriously, that is just shocking. I feel like you couldn't do that with anyone other than Edward, though. Edward's like enough of a pushover in so many ways that he's just like, oh yeah, she married my brother instead. Like, what? That's bizarre.
Exactly. It's so weird. And the fact that everyone takes it quite well as well. They're like, oh, okay. And I'm like, that's weird. Right? Like, she was literally engaged to the other brother like a month ago. Stop.
Oh my God. Like, how did she even manage that as well? Like, that's the most... Honestly, it's very bizarre.
Like what at a ball? I think she meets Robert at a ball, doesn't she? And then pretty much straight afterwards, she's well in there. So she must have got some good intel pretty quickly and just been like, nice.
She was just like, she was dead set on their particular fortune. She was like, oh, it's gone from Edward to Robert. I'm going for Robert now.
Love it. I mean, hands off to her, like good for her. You've got to do what you've got to do.
We've got to survive in this world, guys. Come on.
And Edward, as much as I like him, he's quite nice, isn't he? Like,
he's a bit of a wet lettuce, I think.
That's exactly how I would phrase it. He is a bit of a wet blanket, really. It's just kind of like, oh well, like being married to him would probably be quite annoying.
I know. Can you imagine? He'd never make any decision. What do you want for tea? And just be like, oh, I don't mind. What do you want to do today? I don't mind. What do you want to do? Like,
yeah. No, I think it'd last a few months before I'd accidentally axe murder him.
And marry his brother.
Yeah, I'm just like, hi Robert.
So funny. So I think that's what makes Sense and Sensibility super interesting, though, is that female line, and they're able to control the money. So if we look at Edward after that point, once he's disinherited, and he takes like the living of Colonel Brandon's at 300, I think then with Eleanor's money on top of that, it would be like £850 a year to live on, which is quite minimal compared to, I think Edward's inheritance was supposed to be around £2,000 a year as well. So very similar to Colonel Brandon. They're pretty much equal in that sense when it comes to heroes, which is really different to Pride and Prejudice, where Bingley and Darcy, it's so significantly different.
I didn't actually look at how much does Willoughby earn. I mean, we know like Willoughby's financial situation is quite interesting, obviously, because it dictates so much of what he does in the book. But how much has he got rocking on?
So I'm not 100% sure, but Mrs. Smith's, so she has an estate and a fortune, and that's meant to go to Willoughby. But she disinherits him upon learning that Eliza got pregnant and the fact that Willoughby refuses to marry her. So that's why Willoughby then goes after Miss Grey and her £50,000. So when Willoughby marries, he's pretty well off. But I think Miss Smith's fortune, I think we'd probably be in between the 2,000, 4,000 ballpark, I think.
Nice. Again, clever boy.
Yeah, very nice.
What he did, but him and Lucy Steele would be like a great.
They should come up with plans together. Yeah,
exactly.
Clearly.
Maybe they did. Maybe that is how this all happened. They had a nice little plot in some parlour off the...
What are you going to do? How are you going to sort yourself out?
Exactly.
Like, I've got myself a Miss Grey. But Miss Grey, I mean, that's impressive. £50,000. That's a massive fortune.
Yeah, that's more than Georgiana Darcy, right? So she is absolutely cream of the crop. Great target. Go for it, Willoughby.
Seriously. And what confuses me is why she would go for Willoughby. I don't know if it's just because he's like young and youthful and good looking and fun, but I'm like...
Yeah. Maybe it was just a case of maybe her other options were all just old men, the usual. Because we have to imagine back then, you're probably not going to have a great, even if you're fabulously wealthy, you're still going to have a pretty poor selection of people coming after you most of the time. And if you look at all the social pressure to make good matches as well, that cuts your pool considerably down. So maybe she was just like, I'll marry someone hot.
Yeah, I mean, she's got the money to do so why not? She's got enough to support them both. Yeah,
as long as he behaves and doesn't gamble it all away and stuff, then it should be fine, really.
But not the fact that he's like moping over some other woman still and blooming like drunk at people's houses. But
I mean, it's not an ideal match.
At least they're not poor.
Yeah, exactly. He can cry into like golden tissues. It's fine.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so funny. So I think in sensibility, then what it suggests is people are pretty much on the same ballpark, I'm guessing. What's interesting, the fact that it's Edward's money goes down the female line is obviously the Dashwoods doesn't, and that's why they end up in the predicament where they go to Barton Cottage in the first place, because their money doesn't pass on to them. It goes to the son, the first son, from his previous wife. So that's why they basically have no money whatsoever. So that's really interesting that there's two different scenarios in the same book.
Absolutely. And I think, again, if you compare it to Pride and Prejudice, this is the scenario that maybe Mary Bennet will be facing in the future. You know, think about it. The Dashwood scenario, when Mr. Bennet dies, Mary's going to have that exact same scenario, if you think about it. So it'd be interesting in a way to see what she would have done if people did explore that.
Oh, my days. Can you imagine moving to a cottage with Mrs. Bennet?
Well, I'm sure her nerves would take up most of the space.
So I think moving on from Sense and Sensibility, the next book that I want to look at is Persuasion. So Money and Persuasion is really interesting because although Anne's family, so the Elliot family, are actually status-wise in a really good position, since Anne's mother died, they've gone into a bit of disarray, it would seem. Yeah, so basically Sir Walter Elliot's fortune, I think, is around like what at the moment is about £10,000, which will be divided amongst the children. So Anne will get about £3,000 upon his death, potentially. But then we have to bear in mind that he's got a lot of debt. He has to move out of his house to go to like his house in town. Because he's got so much debt and really can't afford to live properly. Both of his daughters are much older. So Anne's around 27. I don't think Elizabeth is young either. So, and they're both unmarried. He obviously has Miss Clay dotted around because I think he's thinking about marrying her to try and bring some more money in, I guess. But it looks like most of that fortune, the Elliot fortune, will go to Mr. Elliot, I believe.
So it's a tricky one.
Exactly. And obviously Mr. Elliot tries to go for Anne, but Anne's still interested in Wentworth, so it doesn't really work out too well for them. I also think Sir Walter Elliot's in like debt to creditors. So I don't know if he's got a bit of a gambling problem as well, that he's like owes other people money. But it definitely says that they're not in a good position at all.
Yeah, I think, isn't it? It's kind of hinted that almost part of it is his kind of own vanity as well. So maybe he spends a lot of money on clothes and nice furniture, you know, making appearances better than what they are. So maybe that is a big part of it, is he bites off more than he can afford.
Yeah. No, I think 100%, like a lot of his character is keeping up appearances, like he's obsessed with it. So I 100% agree. Like even when Anne's like, we need to make cuts here and there, he's like, no, we're not doing that because what will people think of us and that kind of thing. And Anne's like, well, we're poor actually, like in reality.
Exactly. It doesn't really matter what they think if we can't live anywhere. So.
Right. And what's really interesting is we realize the tables have really turned because Anne originally refused Wentworth's first proposal because he had no fortune of his own. Wentworth then goes off to the war and comes back with £25,000 worth of a fortune, which if we go off that 5% theory is just over, I think it's just under £1,500 a year, which, you know, isn't on Bingley's level, but that's still really decent when you had nothing to begin with.
And earned as well. Again, not inherited. He's earned it. It's this whole thing where he's done it himself. So people would have that snobbery against him, but it's a good amount of money. It's good standing. So
I think it's impressive if you come from nowhere. And I did a little bit of research because I saw that it was prize money and I was a bit confused. I was like, what is this? Like the lottery or something? But
just bingo. Just
bingo. But I did a little bit of research on it, and basically during the Napoleonic Wars, if you were on a ship, you were there was reward money if you were able to capture French ships and their crew, and basically that reward money was then split amongst everybody on the ship. If you were the captain, you got a bigger proportion of it. So that's basically where Wentworth's fortune comes from, because he's at the top of the food chain as the captain. He gets quite a lot of money out of it. And like I said, it's not massive, but it is when you've come from nothing. You've basically earned all this money in your career. And I think even though, like, obviously in the realms of persuasion and Sir Walter Elliot, he really looks down on naval officers. But I think in general, if you were a captain, I think you are doing quite well at that point.
Yeah, I think socially they are quite a respectable. I think the military is kind of different from trade, isn't it? Because the military is keeping the country safe, and it has got that good connotations of you're fighting for the right thing and all of that. So it's kind of slightly separated from someone who sells carpets or something, you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
like, probably make your money doing that too, but people are going to be like, oh, right. Whereas
Right.
if you're fighting for your country against the French and commanding a vessel, you know, it's got all this glory with it as well. So you're probably much more respected. So
Yeah, I think so. And I think along with that comes a title, even though it's not like Sir or Lord or, you know, what, anything along those lines. It's still a title. Like Captain Wentworth is still pretty impressive. And you're not just, you know, John, are you?
Bob.
Yeah, it's me, Bob. No status, no title. Hello. I sell my carpets.
Well, yeah, sorry, Bob, it's not happening. Get a ship and we'll talk.
Get yourself some prize money. Get down to bingo.
Gosh.
Oh, so funny. So in terms of like persuasion, that's pretty much a lot of what I was looking at. Did you have any thoughts on Wentworth and persuasion and income?
I mean, what surprised me most about Persuasion was actually how well off they are. I think every time I read it, I kind of always think of him, because he's a sea captain, not actually being as rich as he is, just because, again, he is earning it himself. He has done something. And I kind of have this weird vision in my head where all the people in Austen who are super, super mega rich, like Darcy, don't do anything. So the fact that he has actually got a profession and things like that, it's easy to forget how well off he is. You know, that fortune is a good fortune to have. And if you add Anne's money into it, if she does get money, of course, depending on the inheritance, they're a well-off couple. So
yeah, I think so. And I mean, there's no saying that they could even have children after this point, because obviously Anne's 27, which I know it's not that old. Lots of people have children into their 30s, but you never know in that time period. And also you never know about Anne's particular situation. So if it was to be the two of them, or even one child, it's still going to go quite far, that money is. And I think for Anne, any situation is going to be good now, because one, she's on like the brink of being classed as like a spinster or an old maid. And two, she still manages to marry somebody that she loves. And three, he's actually in a financial situation that's better off than her father now.
Absolutely. If anything, she's got a better life ahead. Her sister doesn't really, does she? From what I can remember, I don't think there's anything.
So Mary married Charles, who, and they're just like living, they have kids and everything, but she doesn't seem like she's like living the best life. She's
to be ill about everything.
She honestly drives me mad.
What I find really interesting, Jane must have hated someone called Mary, right? Every character called Mary is just utterly miserable or boring, or and I kind of love that.
I love that she writes one of her like most beautiful and like loving characters, Jane. That's gold.
I love that. Just like, the most beautiful of the family was named Jane, like me. I mean, good on her.
Guys, if I'm writing a book, there's the main character who's wonderful and exciting and beautiful. Her name will be Izzy, okay?
Absolutely. Handsome, clever, rich, Izzy. Perfect.
I'm putting it out there. It needs to happen. Or maybe if I find somebody else who's writing a book, I'll say to them, I'm like, I've got such a great idea for a character for you.
Absolutely.
Oh dear, so funny. So I think from that, it's really interesting to see somebody from the military is actually doing well, because from reference, some of the other characters who are in the military that we see are really not. Like Wickham, obviously we see him gambling away all of his fortune, doesn't really have any money himself. Particularly like the militia, like I didn't realize this, but that's like a specific branch that was made for people who don't have any money or have done something bad to society. And I think it's interesting that we don't actually, like Wickham tries to say to Elizabeth, it's because he doesn't have any money and he's trying to make his way. But when I read that, I was like, it's really interesting that actually Wickham could have been in the militia because of his behavior.
Absolutely, yeah, of course. That would make perfect sense, wouldn't it? I hadn't really considered that before. That does make real logical sense because he is a bad boy. So,
Exactly.
yeah.
I didn't think about that, but I was like, considering he lies about everything else, I mean, what's to say that that's not why he's in there originally anyway?
Absolutely. I think that would, if anything, that would add an extra element of his character. I think that really does make perfect sense. So maybe people reading it back when it was first written would have completely got that. And that's something we've lost as modern readers, of just understanding that from the word go. So that's interesting.
Yeah, I know. So, yeah, I think it's nice to have Captain Wentworth and him to be kind of a successful military personnel. I like it. So let's move on to the next book. So the next one I have on my list is Emma. And as we were saying at the start, Emma's like such a unique book because our heroine is handsome, clever, rich, all of the in between. She's living the dream.
Yeah, it's great because it changes the whole framework. Look at Austen novels. We're looking at people who are searching for husbands basically as the main drive of their whole character journey a lot of the time. Emma doesn't need that. So she's having fun, she's playing with society, it's great. It's a really different and more comedic book, I think, and that's why it's my favorite. I just think it's really funny and has the chance to play with things that the other ones don't necessarily have because everyone isn't in a great position. But it also shows how too much money is also possibly a bad thing in terms of just how you treat other people in some ways. Like Miss Smith is kind of carried along with her, and the intentions are good, obviously, but it is all a bit kind of I'm a rich person and here's my kind of plaything vibe in some places, which is, yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think you're right, though. Like the fact that Emma has money means that we don't have that same anxiety about finances in this book in the same way. I think like Harriet Smith is probably more like our usual heroines in the sense that it's kind of uncertain. And they even say, because obviously Emma's convinced that Harriet's in a position to marry Mr. Elton, but Mr. Knightley's like, nobody knows what Harriet's upbringing is. They don't know who her family are. She's obviously lives in like a boarding school, so nobody really knows what's going on there. And I think because Emma's so wealthy, she doesn't actually realize the bounds of what that means, like financially. And I think as readers, we end up seeing it through Emma's eyes, and we kind of forget those concerns and what it's like if you don't have the money. And again, I think it's interesting to see that Emma and her sister actually will do okay, even though there's no kind of male line. They'll still inherit the money. I think it'll be their husbands who control it, but I think still, it's still in the same family. I mean, they both marry Knightleys, so
which is kind of weird, right?
Right, a little bit, yeah.
But I mean, we'll forgive that. But it's still a bit odd. I mean, I think there are weirder things in Austen, so
right. No, that's so true. So Mr. Knightley is the hero. He's in a pretty good position. He's classed as a landowner and gentleman farmer, which is really interesting. I think he's a little bit more hands-on than we see some of the other gentlemen being. Like he's quite close with Robert Martin and catches up with him and chats with him well, and we see that, which I think is really nice. And he has Donwell Abbey. He's the eldest son, so he's actually the one going to inherit it. I think some people think that his brother John's the oldest because he marries first and he moves away. But actually, John moves to London with Isabella because he wants to make his own fortune. And obviously, that may be in trade or what have you, but he moves to London to do that. So, yeah, I think that's really interesting. I saw somewhere that it says that Mr. Knightley has little spare money, but then I saw somewhere else that said Mr. Knightley was really well off. So I'm not 100% sure. I don't know why he wouldn't have loads of money. He's got no children at the time. Yeah, I don't.
Unless he's secretly gambling along, which seems to be the curse of everyone back then. I think he should be fine. I can't imagine him spending money on things that wouldn't need spending money on. You know what I mean? He's not frivolous. If anything, that's something he hates in other people. He's more than likely not a gambler. He's not an alcoholic. So, he wouldn't be able to spend through it, I wouldn't imagine. So he should be okay.
Right. And I think that actually Donwell's supposed to be the grandest estate in Highbury. So with that being said, technically it would suggest he's in a better position than Emma, I would say.
Absolutely. Otherwise, why would Emma be living in a less grand place with all that money? You know, we know that she's certainly not lacking. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah, so I'm not 100% sure, but I would say, obviously, he has tenants. We know that he has Robert Martin, who owns the farm. There's all income coming in from that. I'd say potentially he's maybe around more Bingley's area, maybe a little bit more than that, maybe around 5,000 a year. Highbury's a smaller town than like Derbyshire with Darcy, so I'm assuming there's probably less income. Like his estate isn't quite as grand, but like obviously Darcy said to own half of Derbyshire. That's quite a lot. That's a lot of land.
It's a tricky one to compete with, isn't it?
Exactly. So, and obviously the fact that he's close with the Woodhouses, and I think we see with Emma like some of her snobbery, like when I think it's the Clays invite her round and they're from trade, and Emma's like reluctant to accept their invite, even though they are quite wealthy. Basically, like we see from Bingley, being in trade doesn't mean you're not wealthy. She's still reluctant because of their like position in society. So it's interesting. But Emma's said to have an inheritance of about £30,000, so similar to Georgiana Darcy. And yeah, I mean, if you think about that and then think about Mr. Knightley bringing in kind of like 5,000 a year, say, 5% off 30,000 as well would be, 1,500 on top of that. So we're talking about like nearly, just under £7,000, say, a year. That's pretty decent. We're bordering what Darcy's bringing in a year. So I think they'd be living a nice
millions of today's money, right?
Oh yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
They would absolutely fine.
Right. Totally be millionaires. They're settled in the town that they're in. It doesn't seem like they travel too much. I know that Mr. Knightley travels to London sometimes and he goes and stays with like John and Isabella. But then again, like, you know what I mean? They've got a property there. He goes and stays with them. These aren't lavish people. Emma, I think that she does indulge in things, but I don't think you don't see her over indulging like somebody like Mrs. Elton, who really flaunts things, or even someone like Mary Crawford, who's obsessed with wealth and status. So I think I think they seem like people who are pretty content with what's going on. And even though I think they do involve themselves in things that cost more money, like something really interesting. I don't know if you've ever seen The Repair Shop on the telly. No. Okay, there's like this program in the UK, it's called The Repair Shop. Anyway, someone brought in this scrapbook and they did like background on it, and they were saying how kind of in the Regency era, scrapbooking was really popular amongst people with lots of money because it was a really expensive thing to do. And I think Emma and Harriet actually created a scrapbook together. So that made me think, like, obviously she partakes in things that do cost more money, but I don't think she's, over the top with it. So I think both of them would be pretty okay, living happily.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're right. Emma can't go too over the top because one of the things she hates about Mrs. Elton is that she is too out there and stuff, isn't it? So I think there's a sort of, refusal to be that flamboyant. So she wouldn't be spending tons of money on dresses. She wouldn't be spending lots of money on impressing people because they already know who she is and she knows that she's great.
Right. I mean, who does she need
to impress anyone?
Yeah, who does she need to impress? She lives in the same town that she has her whole life. Everybody respects her and adores her. She doesn't really need to. It's not like she's going into London. I mean, she hardly travels very much at all. So it's not like she's going into London and going to balls there where she'll be around people who've got like the latest fashion, etc. She's around people that in that society she would already be 10,000 steps ahead of them. So I think that means that they don't need to spend as much because of that.
Absolutely. And if you look at her immediate circle as well, I mean, to bring it back, I mean, she does still see Miss Bates and all of that, who are obviously so far below her in terms of financial steps. So there is no need to impress anyone. They all, like, as you say, they probably already view her as this massive pinnacle of everything good. So she's having a great time. And she also has to do, she doesn't have to spend loads of money on entertainments or anything because, again, they would like anything. So, yeah, it's quite easy.
Right. But then another situation in Emma, which is really interesting, is Frank Churchill's situation, which is very similar to Willoughby's. So Frank Churchill's taken in by the Churchills. He's obviously Mr. Weston's son from his original marriage, but he's taken in by his aunt, and he's set to inherit their estate and fortune. But basically that's why he keeps his engagement to Jane secret, because he knows that will mean that he's disinherited. So like Willoughby, it comes with ties. They have to do what they're told by their aunt, etc. And I think you see more with Frank than Willoughby how much this affects their freedom, because you see it in Frank's like turmoil, where he's in his behavior, like he acts out quite a lot because of it. In the end, obviously his aunt dies and he inherits a fortune, is able to marry Jane, which, you know, is great for Jane.
Good name
great
there, yeah.
Pick up the Janes.
The most sensitive, artistic woman who Emma's jealous of. Love that.
So true. I know, so funny. So they end up being pretty well off, and I think that's nice because it means there's, and this town's crazy. Like, think how many like big couples they've got going on. And they've got Knightley and Emma, like the king and queen of Highbury. They've got blooming Frank and Jane rocking up now. Like, it's definitely turning into quite a affluent area.
Absolutely. It's like the Chelsea. Gosh, mental.
I know, it's kind of crazy. So yeah, I think money in Emma is definitely an interesting one, just because there's more of it going around. So yeah, absolutely. I think that's great. Are you happy to move on to the next book?
Go for it.
Okay, so the next one we have on our list is Mansfield Park. And I thought we'd talk about Edmund Bertram first, but I think the money in Mansfield's really interesting because of where it comes from in the first place. So I'm pretty sure it's got something to do with the slave trade and a sugar plantation in the West Indies. Sir Thomas Bertram seems to go off a lot over there and like tries to figure things out, etc. So I think out of all the books, this one's definitely a lot more controversial of where their wealth comes from.
Absolutely. I think that kind of plays into it all, doesn't it? It's kind of like, oh, they may be wealthy, but there's that sort of general kind of feeling that it's not good wealth through something that's very, I don't know. I think there's that kind of undertone, isn't there? It's kind of running through the book that the Bertrams are not very nice people, for not just because of their actions. So.
Right, absolutely. And they're said to be pretty well off. But again, they have a gambler in the family amongst their midst who causes a little bit of financial strain. So the eldest brother, Thomas, who's set to inherit the estate, has a serious gambling and party problem. In fact, he nearly dies from it. So,
I mean, rock on. He takes it to that level. You've got to.
I know. I feel like he's the only, like, he really takes it far. It goes extreme with this guy. So, but because of all of his actions, it actually means that Edmund is denied like the clergy position on their particular estate. He has to go and find like another one because of his brother's actions, and they can't afford to give Edmund that property. They have to give it to somebody else, which because of that roll in the Crawfords. So the Crawfords are pretty well off. Henry Crawford brings in about 400,000 a year, so very close to Bingley. Mary Crawford has an inheritance of £20,000, so really decent. And they're really interested in the Bertrams. The fact that Mary's so interested in Edmund in the family, and at one point she actually wishes that Thomas was dead so that Edmund could take over.
I kind of love her for that. I mean, she's quite open with her ambitions, isn't she? And she just doesn't want to mess about. She's like, the clergy's boring.
Yeah, to pick something else. How about the law? How about the military? What are you feeling?
I mean, it's quite refreshing in a way to have someone like that in an Austen novel who's just quite outwardly awful, but in a quite enjoyable way. So.
Right. I think she's a really interesting character. I really enjoy her. Like you said, because she's so just open about her feelings about money and position. She says, this is what I want. I'm really into you, but I can't marry you unless, we're on the same wavelength here. Edmund really, he goes as far as being like, I might change what I'm going to do so that I can be with Mary. It's only until he goes to London with her and finds out that she's like really materialistic and a bit snobby, and then he changes his mind. But yeah, it's really interesting. So these families are entangled. And then also Mr. Rushworth, who's actually engaged to Maria. And Mr. Rushworth is actually the wealthiest person mentioned, I believe, in Austen's books, like male-wise. So he has 12,000 a year, so more than Darcy.
Okay, yeah, that's a shocker. Look at that.
Right.
Yeah, so she's a fool, really.
Yeah, exactly. That's literally what I was about to say. Maria is the biggest numpty of all of these women because she gets Mr. Rushworth only to run off with Henry. And obviously Henry's not, bad off, but she's not married to Henry, so she just disgraces herself and ends up living with Mrs. Norris.
Yeah, not the vibe. Bad times. Oh, Mariah.
Why would you do that? So I know Mr. Rushworth comes across as a bit of a numpty, to be honest with you, but that he's a wealthy guy. He's got a lot of money going around, so that's really interesting, I think. And I think the fact that Mr. Rushworth is interested in Maria would suggest that the Bertrams have a lot of money.
Yeah, it's going to be a good connection, isn't it? Regardless, so he wouldn't have deemed with that level of fortune to go for anyone who wasn't a good match to begin with. Yeah, she's stupid. What a really rich man who's stupid, great partner. Think about it. You could just have the best life. Like, he's not smart enough to catch on to anything you're doing. Marry him, have a great time.
I know, literally. This is why she just takes it too far and runs off with Henry. Like, what's she up to? Come on.
To that, how old is Mariah? She's
not that
young,
old. Yeah, she is quite young. Yeah, I think she's probably around, like 20, 21. I think maybe Emma's age, like around that period, yeah.
We all make stupid mistakes, but gosh, what a bad one.
I know, and what's terrible is her father's like, do you want to call off the engagement and go with somebody else? Like, she had the option and she says no, and then goes and messes it up anyway.
Yeah. It's a book of bad decisions.
It really is. It's really interesting. Yeah, 100%. That like what happens in the book, and yeah, I think so. And in the end, obviously, Fanny and Edmund get married, and basically, what I found online is they'd be living off around 700 a year because Fanny obviously doesn't have anything to bring to the table. So, and then I had a look in estimate for about what that would be. In this day and age, it's actually around £35,000, which as a single income is fantastic. For two people who are then going to go on to have children, is a little bit tighter. So yeah, they're not terrible, but they're it's definitely going to be tighter than some of the other couples. I believe they're maybe probably more on par with Edward and Eleanor at that point. So again, but then that's the nature of marriage and marrying someone who becomes a clergy. Obviously, you have a lot of security though in that position. So you have somewhere to live. You've got connections with the village.
You don't have to buy your property or anything, do you? If you're in the clergy, you're given a vicarage or a parsonage or whatever. So there is no expense of that, I suppose. So
exactly.
I guess compared to someone else who doesn't have that, who would earn the same income, they would probably be better off financially. But yeah,
right. So the difference between had he married Mary and still being a clergyman, which I just don't think ever would have happened, but they would have been looking at more closer to £2,000 a year. So very different situation, but he never would have married Mary and also been a clergyman. So there probably would have been more income because of that. So yeah, I think that's really interesting though. There's a lot of money going around Mansfield Park, but also a lot of negative energy around that money. There's some bad people about, and definitely there's that greed, I think, in this book.
It's an interesting book because it is my least favourite, just because I find Fanny and Edmund quite insufferable, which is obviously not what you want from your main characters. But I do think the actual dynamic is so interesting. So it's a shame that in a way it's not as entertaining, because if you look beneath the surface, as you say, there's greed, there's turmoil, there's all these characters who are very on it with what they want and all these scandals, but somehow, because we're we're getting it all from Fanny's perspective and things, it's all a bit like, oh. You know?
Right. And what's really strange, like in comparison to some of the others, is how insular this book is. Like a lot of it's just set in the house. Do you know what I mean? I always think that's really weird compared to like Pride and Prejudice. I mean, she moves around the whole of the country, or Emma, that she goes around the town. We meet different people. We're in different houses. Mansfield Park's so insular. It's like a bubbling pot. Like you just know it's all going to come crumbling down, really.
And it does. I mean, gosh, it does. So, yeah. I also like that. I mean, this is just a personal thing, but I find the ending of Mansfield Park really weird because a chapter before the end, they're still kind of calling each other brother and sister, and then suddenly it's like, but then we got married. It was great, and it was like, oh, okay.
Right. Honestly, if anyone's listening, I have an episode that is called Fanny Price, Heroine or House Elf. And in there, I talk about this fact that it's like they're talking as if they're brother and sister. At the start, it says that they compare Edmund to her actual brother, and then they get married. And yeah, it's like totally brushed under. But in that book itself, they actually talk about how weird it is to like marry cousins and things like that. And I'm like, that's so strange that they mention how weird it would be, and then it still happens.
Yeah, right? Like, in a way, I kind of feel she should have married Henry Crawford and then reformed him and, you know, kind of... but instead it just kind of went for a weird kind of vaguely sort of incest, but not incest kind of vibe. It was, yeah.
No, that's so interesting. I literally had this conversation in another episode with Anne, and she actually turned around to me and she said, I actually thought that Henry Crawford would be reformed and him and Fanny get together and he'd be more like a Mr. Darcy character, that it was all like he was able to overcome his bad nature, and then, well, obviously Mr. Darcy isn't that bad, but it's like those characteristics that aren't favorable, and then becomes a really good hero basically in the end. And I agree. I think Henry Crawford's situation, I mean, 4,000 a year, I really believe that Henry did actually have feelings for Fanny. I think he's a fickle person, but I did think his feelings for Fanny were genuine, because what else can he get from that?
Yeah, I mean, what else? Why would you do it? You know, it may have started off as maybe a little bit of a game, but I mean, you don't take a game that far. So
right, there's nothing to be gained from it. And I think that of all the people he's honest with, he's always honest with his sister Mary. And he even says to Mary, like, actually, I'm kind of interested in Fanny now. So I wish Fanny had been the one to tame Henry and they could have had like a good life together. Because Fanny and Edmund, it doesn't work for me. I'm sorry.
It's bad vibes. It's really weird. But...
I know, absolutely. And also, I'm really sorry, but if I was with someone and they've been totally caught in another woman for the entire of my book, and then they come up, no.
No, absolutely not. Like, even like little things, he was always just like, oh, I'm gonna do this with Mary, bye. And it's just like, you're not nice. Like, actually, like, he's not that nice as a person. He's quite insufferably pious, which, you know, fine, but like there are certain bits where I'm just like, you're quite boring, just like, just stop with your preaching at me. And yeah, no, he's not the one. Sorry, Edmund.
No, he's definitely not my favorite either. And yeah, I definitely think it's an interesting family dynamic, and how it all comes about in the end is surprising. I think Fanny's the only one, probably Fanny and Edward are the only ones that really thrive at the end, but they're not really thriving either. So
yeah, everyone's in a kind of tolerable position, but it's not great.
I know.
So, yeah, interesting.
Yeah, really not amazing, that's for sure. So that's pretty much all of the books that I had on the list and all of the people. Do you have anyone else from any of the books or anything else you want to mention on like the income in total? Be good to do like some cross comparison. Who do we think, who would we go for?
Go for? Gosh, that is a tricky one. Well, from a financial point, where are we going? Well, Mr. Rushworth, apparently. So if we're just gonna be a fortune hunter, he's top of my list. Go for it. Yeah. I'm gonna team up with Lucy Steele. We'll have a little chat, and
yeah. I think if I wanted a decent husband and the money, I think Mr. Darcy's still looking like a pretty good catch.
Yeah, I mean, Darcy fits that dream in so many ways, doesn't he? He is a nice guy underneath it all. He's wealthy. He's got he owns half of the county. You can't really go too far wrong with him. I mean, I still like Bingley as an option. I think he's sweet. He's obviously a little bit thick to be easily influenced by everyone. I mean, I've always liked Mr. Knightley. And again, Donwell Abbey, I could live there. Why not?
Old money again. So Mr. Darcy, Mr. Knightley have the benefit of being kind of like a more established person. But then Bingley has the benefit, if you were to be with Bingley, you could reinvent like that family structure. Like you're the start of the line in a sense still. So yeah, there's absolutely still room to grow a lot, I think.
Yeah, and especially as then, if we think about how things eventually change a few hundred years down the line. I mean, ancestral money doesn't cut it. So trade money is where it's at. So really, if we had the great fortune of foresight, then people like Bingley is probably the better option.
Right, like trade only gets better and better. I mean, look at the Industrial Revolution, which, we're talking like a bit down the line. Like if you look at Elizabeth Gaskell's books, like North and South, that's kind of set around Cheshire, Manchester area, and they're like thriving at that point. So if Mr. Bingley sticks with it,
Yeah, absolutely. Mr. Thornton, he was well off, right? Yeah. So there we go. Tradesman for the win.
Yeah. The question is, do you want the new money? Do you want the old money? Well, there we go.
I mean, money in general would great, fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
As long as you don't have to be stuck with someone like Mr. Collins, I think you're fine, right?
Ooh, oh my gosh, no, I can't even imagine. That'd be pretty awful. And I think with a lot of them, they have this income coming in. I think that's what would put me off Wentworth slightly, is even though they've got the interest to live off, that's kind of it in terms of what's going to be coming in from this point. It's not like they have land with like tenant farmers, that kind of thing, where there's going to be extra money coming in.
Absolutely. And also, I mean, he is a captain still, right? He is still doing stuff, or has he stopped by that point? I'm not
100% sure. He's definitely maintains like the title of captain, but I think he's like ready to settle down. I don't know if he's going to go back, but then I'm not entirely sure. He's not that old.
He's not like super, super old. But then, I mean, again, think of a risk factor. Ships back then, if he dies, which is probably much more likely than someone like Darcy suddenly keeling over out of nowhere, what are we doing here? I mean, she would probably get a payment of it, but as you say, there's no money coming in. So then what situation are we in?
Oh, back with her family and her father and sister. Oh my God, no.
Just want to drown herself.
Oh my gosh, no, that just sounds like an awful situation. Absolutely. I would not be there for that. I think Mr. Knightley sounds great if you're Emma, because like both of you, you're going to be absolutely comfortable, happy. You're in your little town, it's all working out. So I'm always a bit of a Knightley fan, that's to be sure. But I think if you're coming from like a Bennet sister situation, a Jane Fairfax kind of situation, I think a Darcy is what you need, or a Bingley.
So what we really need is just someone rich and handsome to turn up and sort it all out. So Mrs. Bennet was completely right. There is a lot of excitement to be had. So there you go.
That's so true. That's hilarious. Oh, this has been such a fun episode, though. I really enjoyed it. It was good to just kind of look more on like the financial side of things and how it breaks down.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had such a good time. And it's really made me think kind of at a wider level about certain characters who I don't really consider as much, and how interestingly they do fit into these novels and their narratives just from a financial perspective. It really, Jane Austen was a genius. Think about it. That society she creates is so intricate and yet fit together so well. Fascinating.
I know. So interesting. But thanks so much for coming on. It's honestly been a blast. So do you want to let people know where they can find you, what you're up to, that kind of thing?
Well, don't stalk me. No, no. You can find me on Instagram at @thebookboy. And that's about it, really. I don't really do other social media because I'm lazy.
Your stories are really funny. I love following your stories.
Just me, just being mental. So apologies in advance if anyone thinks I'm crazy. I am.
Oh, don't worry about it. Honestly, if anyone follows me, they won't be shocked by any other more mental than me. Honestly, it's crazy. I have like a whole story that's what is this, and it's just me with like a weird face doing, basically memeing myself. So
we like it.
It's so great. So thanks everyone for listening, and we will see you in the next episode.